Hi guys, today we are going to discuss a story that sounds like a myth, but is carved into the bones of European history, the day a peasant army destroyed one of the most powerful professional forces on earth. Imagine this for a moment: steel-clad knights, banners snapping in the wind, thousands of trained soldiers marching in perfect order, their armor gleaming like a moving wall of iron. These men had spent their entire lives preparing for war. They had horses bred for battle, swords forged by master smiths, and commanders who had crushed enemies across half of Europe. When they marched, cities surrendered. When they charged, armies broke. Now imagine what stood in their way: not another grand army, not a rival empire, not even trained soldiers. They faced farmers, shepherds, hunters, men who had spent their lives working the land, not wielding weapons. Most of them had never worn armor. Many had never held a sword. Some didn't even own proper spears, only farming tools, wooden clubs, and whatever they could carry from their homes. By every rule of medieval warfare, what was about to happen should have been a massacre. The knights should have ridden them down, the professionals should have slaughtered them. History should have forgotten their names, but that is not what happened. Because on a cold morning in the mountains of Switzerland in the year 1315, something impossible took place, something so shocking that it would change warfare forever. This is the story of the Battle of Morgarten. At the beginning of the 14th century, the House of Habsburg was one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. Their armies were filled with heavy cavalry, noble knights trained from childhood to fight. These men were not just soldiers. They were a social class raised on war, honor, and domination. They believed with absolute certainty that no force on earth could stand against them in open battle, and for the most part they were right. When Habsburg armies marched, smaller lords surrendered, peasant militias fled, castles opened their gates. Their armored cavalry could shatter any enemy formation with a single charge, but in the heart of the Alps, a different kind of people lived. In the narrow valleys and high mountain passes of what is now central Switzerland, small communities of farmers had carved out a harsh existence. Life there was brutal, the soil was thin, winters were long, survival depended on cooperation, toughness, and knowing every inch of the land. These people were not rich, they were not famous, but they were fiercely independent. For generations, they had governed themselves, protecting their land with local militias rather than feudal lords. They hunted in the forests, guided cattle through steep mountain paths, and defended their homes from raiders. Their weapons were simple: spears, axes, crossbows, but their greatest strength was something no knight could buy. They knew the mountains. When the Habsburg Duke Leopold I decided to crush these rebellious peasants, he expected an easy victory. He gathered an army of thousands, heavily armored knights, professional infantry, and seasoned commanders. To him, the Swiss were nothing more than unruly farmers who needed to be reminded of their place. The plan was simple: march through the narrow Morgarten Pass, surprise the Swiss, crush them, end the rebellion in a single blow. What Leopold did not realize was that every step his army took was being watched. High above the winding mountain road, Swiss scouts observed the advancing column. They counted the knights, they studied the formation, and they saw something that would change everything. The Habsburg army was long, tightly packed and trapped between a steep mountainside on one side and a swampy lake on the other. There was no room to maneuver, no space for cavalry to charge, no way to escape. The professionals were walking into a death trap. As dawn broke over the mountains, the Swiss peasants took their positions. They hid among the trees and rocks on the slopes above the road. They rolled heavy boulders to the edge. They raised their spears and axes. Their hands shook not from fear, but from the cold and the weight of what they were about to do. They knew this was their only chance. If they failed, their homes would burn, their families would be enslaved, their freedom would be erased forever. Below them, the Habsburg column marched forward, confident and unaware. Knights laughed, horses snorted, armor clinked as the greatest war machine of its time moved deeper into the mountain pass. Then, without warning, the mountains came alive. Boulders began to fall. Massive stones crashed down onto the road, smashing into men and horses. The tightly packed knights had nowhere to run. Horses screamed, armor crumpled, panic spread through the ranks. Before the professionals could even understand what was happening, the second phase of the attack began. Swiss peasants surged down the slopes. They didn't charge like knights. They didn't move in neat formations. They came like an avalanche. Armed with long spears, heavy clubs, and halberds, they crashed into the trapped Habsburg soldiers. Knights tried to draw their swords, but in the chaos and tight space, their long weapons were useless. Horses slipped in the mud. Men fell, and once a knight was on the ground, his heavy armor turned into a prison. The peasants knew exactly where to strike. They aimed for the gaps in the armor. They pulled knights off their horses. They beat them into the mud and finished them with axes and knives. This was not a duel. This was not chivalry. This was survival. The Habsburg commanders tried to restore order, but it was impossible. Their army, designed for open fields and glorious charges, was being torn apart in a narrow mountain road by men who had nothing to lose. Within hours, one of the greatest professional armies in Europe was in full retreat. Thousands of knights and soldiers were dead. Countless others fled in terror. The peasants of Switzerland, farmers, herders, and hunters, had done what no one thought possible. They had destroyed a professional army, and in doing so they sent a message that echoed across all of Europe. The age of the invincible knight was coming to an end. The Battle of Morgarten was more than just a victory. It was a revolution. It proved that discipline, terrain, and determination could defeat wealth, armor, and noble blood. It showed that ordinary people, fighting for their land and their freedom, could overcome even the most powerful war machines. And from that moment on, kings and emperors began to fear something new. Not rival nobles, not foreign armies, but the people themselves. And this was only the beginning of the Swiss legend. The shockwaves of Morgarten did not end when the last Habsburg knight limped away from the mountain pass. In fact, that battle was only the first crack in something much larger, the entire structure of medieval warfare. Across Europe, news traveled slowly, carried by merchants, monks, and messengers, but when the story finally spread, it sounded unbelievable. A peasant army had destroyed one of the most powerful knightly forces in the Holy Roman Empire, not in a long war, not through siege, not through betrayal, but in a single, brutal ambush. For centuries, the ruling class of Europe had believed one thing above all else, that noble blood and heavy armor made them superior on the battlefield. Knights were not just soldiers, they were symbols of a social order. They owned the land, they commanded the armies, they were born to rule and born to fight. Morgarten challenged all of that. Suddenly, farmers with spears had proven they could defeat aristocrats in steel. That idea was more dangerous than any sword. The Habsburgs tried to pretend it was just a fluke, a lucky ambush, bad terrain, poor timing, anything to avoid admitting the truth, but the Swiss knew better. They had discovered something powerful, that discipline, planning, and unity could overcome even the strongest enemy, and they were about to use it again. After Morgarten, the mountain communities that had once been isolated villages began to think of themselves as something more. They formed alliances, swearing mutual defense. If one valley was attacked, the others would come. If one village burned, the others would answer. This growing network would soon be known as the Swiss Confederation. They did not build grand castles. They did not have kings or dukes. They had meetings, oaths, and militias. Every able-bodied man trained with weapons. Every village knew where to assemble if the enemy came. And most importantly, they began to refine the style of fighting that had won them Morgarten. Instead of knights and horses, they focused on infantry, men on foot, standing shoulder to shoulder, armed with long spears and later with deadly halberds. These weapons were perfect for killing knights. A charging horse could be stopped by a wall of spears. A knight pulled from his saddle was slow and helpless on the ground, and a halberd, a long shaft with an axe blade and a spike, could rip through armor with terrifying efficiency. The Swiss peasants were becoming professional killers of professionals. And Europe was about to learn that Morgarten was no accident. In the years that followed, the Habsburgs launched new campaigns to crush the Swiss rebellion. They brought more troops, more knights, more confidence, and they lost again and again. One of the most devastating encounters came at the Battle of Sempach in 1386. By this time, the Swiss were no longer just farmers with weapons. They were a hardened militia, trained through years of constant threat. The Habsburg army marched in with thousands of armored knights, just as they had always done. They expected the same result they had gotten everywhere else in Europe, a glorious cavalry charge, the enemy breaking, and victory. But the Swiss did not break. They advanced in dense blocks of spearmen, their banners fluttering, their weapons locked together like a living wall. Horses refused to charge into the forest of sharp points. Knights who tried were impaled or dragged down. One by one, the elite of the Habsburg army fell into the dust. At Sempach, Duke Leopold III himself was killed, a noble ruler lying dead on the battlefield, slain by peasants. That image terrified the aristocracy of Europe. It was no longer just one ambush in a mountain pass, it was a pattern. The Swiss infantry had discovered the secret of modern warfare. Cohesion, discipline, and long weapons beat individual skill and expensive armor. Other nations took notice. Kings who could never afford huge numbers of knights realized something important. Training commoners with pikes was far cheaper and far more effective. Slowly, the age of the knight began to die. Across Europe, armies started to copy the Swiss model. Massive formations of infantry, armed with long spears and halberds, became the core of every serious military. The battlefield was changing, but for the Swiss, this transformation came with a price. Their reputation grew. Their victories became famous. And soon, powerful rulers began to see them not just as rebels, but as weapons. Foreign kings started offering Swiss men money to fight for them. These mercenaries, known as Swiss pikemen, became the most feared infantry in Europe. They were peasants no longer. They were professionals now. Men who had learned war the hard way, defending their homes against knights, and now sold that knowledge to the highest bidder. In battles from Italy to France, Swiss formations smashed through enemy lines, earning a reputation for being unstoppable. The irony was cruel. The same kind of common soldiers who had once been oppressed by armored nobles were now being hired by kings to destroy other nobles. But the core truth remained the same. Morgarten had changed everything. It proved that the social order of medieval Europe, the idea that nobles were born to rule and fight, was a lie. Power was no longer locked inside castles and bloodlines. It could be built by ordinary people who stood together. And this terrified the ruling class more than any foreign enemy ever could, because if peasants could defeat knights, what else could they overthrow? Yet this story is not just about victory. It is also about how violence spreads. The Swiss did not become free forever. Their lands remained small. Their lives remained hard. And their sons would die far from home, fighting in wars that had nothing to do with their villages. The peasant army that had once fought for survival became a commodity in the great power struggles of Europe, but history never forgot where it began. On a cold mountain road, when rocks fell from the sky and farmers charged into steel, the world changed. The professional army was no longer untouchable. And the common man had stepped onto the stage of history with blood on his hands and freedom in his heart. By the end of the 14th century, the Swiss were no longer a curiosity, they were a warning. Every king, every emperor, every noble house in Europe knew their name. They knew the stories of Morgarten, they knew about Sempach. They knew how armored knights had been dragged from their horses and slaughtered by men who once tilled fields and herded cattle, and fear began to replace arrogance. Because if peasants could organize, train, and fight this way, then the entire medieval system was standing on rotten wood. But the story of the peasant army did not end in the mountains of Switzerland. In fact, the revolution they started spread like wildfire across Europe, and nowhere was it more explosive than in Central Europe, where another group of ordinary people would rise up, this time not just against nobles, but against the church itself. This brings us to the Hussites. In the early 1400s, Bohemia, in what is now the Czech Republic, was in turmoil. The Catholic Church held immense power, wealth, and land, but among the people anger was growing, corruption was everywhere, priests lived in luxury while peasants starved, bishops preached humility while riding in gold. One man dared to speak out, his name was Jan Hus. He called for reform. He demanded that the church live by its own teachings, and for that he was burned alive in 1415. His execution ignited a fire. Across Bohemia, common people, farmers, craftsmen, townsfolk rose up in rage. They were no longer willing to accept the authority of distant kings and corrupt clergy, and like the Swiss before them, they would soon discover that ordinary people could defeat extraordinary armies. The Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic Church responded the only way they knew how. They declared a crusade, multiple crusades in fact. Knightly armies from across Europe marched toward Bohemia to crush what they saw as a dangerous peasant heresy. These were professional forces, trained knights, mercenaries, experienced commanders. They expected to sweep aside the rebels with ease. They were wrong. The Hussites had studied what the Swiss had done, but they went even further. They took farm wagons and turned them into fortresses. Each wagon was reinforced with wood and iron. Between them, chains were stretched. Behind them stood peasants armed with spears, crossbows, and something terrifyingly new, early firearms and small cannons. These formations became known as wagon forts, and they were deadly. When Crusader knights charged, their horses refused to run into walls of spikes, guns, and roaring fire. Those who did were shot, stabbed, or crushed. Again and again, elite professional armies smashed themselves against these peasant defenses and broke. The Hussites didn't just survive, they destroyed their enemies. Entire Crusader armies fled in panic. Knights dropped their weapons and ran. Bishops begged for mercy. The church, which had ruled Europe for centuries, was being humiliated by peasants with wagons and guns. Once more the lesson was clear. Wealth did not win wars, titles did not win wars, fearlessness, organization, and innovation did. Across Europe, rulers watched in horror as the old order continued to collapse. The peasant was no longer powerless. And this terrified those who had built their lives on the assumption that he was. But with power comes consequence. As peasant armies proved their worth, they were no longer just rebels, they became tools. Kings and princes realized they could raise vast infantry armies instead of relying on expensive nobles. They could conscript farmers, arm them, train them, and send them to die in endless wars. The same force that had once freed people now chained them to new masters. By the 1500s, Europe was full of professional armies made up not of knights, but of common men. The revolution was complete. And yet in one place the story would reach a terrifying climax. Northern Germany, the year 1500, a land of dikes, marshes, and farming villages. This was Dithmarschen, a peasant republic, ruled not by kings but by farmers. And when a massive professional army came to destroy them, history was about to repeat itself one final time. The land of Dithmarschen did not look like a place where legends were born. It was flat, wet, and endlessly gray, a stretch of marshes, muddy fields, and narrow dikes pressed between the North Sea and the forests of northern Germany. To outsiders, it seemed poor and insignificant. To the people who lived there, it was everything. For generations, the farmers of Dithmarschen had ruled themselves. They elected their own leaders. They defended their own land. There were no dukes, no counts. No knights in shining armor riding through their villages. To the great lords of Europe, this was intolerable. A land governed by peasants was a dangerous idea. And so in the year 1500, a coalition of German and Danish nobles decided it was time to crush Dithmarschen once and for all. They assembled a massive professional army, over 12,000 men, including armored knights, mercenaries, and elite infantry. These soldiers were trained for war. They had banners, cannons, and commanders who had fought in the great wars of Europe. Against them stood around 6,000 peasants, farmers, fishermen, men who worked the land and repaired dikes. But like the Swiss and the Hussites before them, the people of Dithmarschen knew something their enemies did not. They knew their terrain. The invaders marched confidently into the marshlands, following the narrow roads that cut through the fields. On either side, waterlogged ground stretched out, too soft for horses, too deep for heavy armor. The peasants waited, they opened floodgates, they cut dikes, they turned their homeland into a sea of mud. When the professional army advanced, it began to sink. Horses slipped, cannons got stuck, knights in heavy armor struggled to move. And when the peasant militia attacked, it was like wolves falling upon trapped prey. Using long spears, pikes, and clubs, they struck from all sides. The professionals could not form proper lines, they could not charge, they could not retreat, it was slaughter. By the end of the day, thousands of the invading army lay dead or drowning in the mud. The peasant republic of Dithmarschen had done what few believed possible. They had destroyed a professional force twice their size. Once again, ordinary people had stood against power and won. But this time, something was different. The world had changed. The victory of Dithmarschen was not followed by freedom spreading across Europe. Instead, it was followed by fear, and fear creates weapons. Kings did not see the peasants as heroes, they saw them as threats. Over the next centuries, rulers across Europe would build enormous standing armies, not to defend peasants, but to control them. The peasant armies that had once shattered knights were now absorbed into the machinery of the state. Their spirit was tamed, their weapons were regulated. Their rebellion was crushed, and yet their legacy remained, because every modern army, every infantry force, every conscripted soldier traces its origins back to moments like Morgarten, Sempach, and the muddy fields of Dithmarschen. The day the peasant learned he could fight, the day the knight learned he could fall, and the day history was forced to change. This is not just a story about battles. It is a story about power, about who holds it, about who loses it. And about what happens when ordinary people realize they are no longer powerless. Because long after the bodies were buried at Morgarten, Sempach, and in the flooded fields of Dithmarschen, something invisible remained behind, an idea. Before the peasant armies rose, the world worked in only one direction. Power flowed from the top down, kings ruled, nobles commanded, knights fought, and peasants obeyed. That was the natural order, or so everyone believed. But when farmers dragged armored knights from their horses, when wagon crews blasted crusaders into retreat, when villagers drowned professional armies in mud, that order cracked. For the first time in European history, common people did not just survive, they defeated the forces that were supposed to be unbeatable. This did not create a perfect world. It did not end war. It did not bring peace. But it did something far more dangerous to the old powers. It made them afraid. Rulers no longer saw peasants as helpless. They saw them as potential armies, as potential rebels, as potential threats, so they adapted. They built standing armies. They introduced conscription. They made sure that weapons belonged to the state, not to villages. The peasant revolution in warfare was absorbed, controlled, and turned into a tool of empire, but it could never be erased, because every time a common soldier picked up a rifle, every time a farmer became a fighter, every time an ordinary person was trained to defend or destroy, the spirit of those medieval peasants lived on. The men who stood at Morgarten were not trying to change the world. They were trying to protect their homes. The Hussites were not dreaming of revolution. They were trying to defend their beliefs. The farmers of Dithmarschen were not trying to overthrow Europe. They were trying to save their land. And yet together they reshaped warfare forever. They proved that courage could defeat wealth. That unity could defeat status. That preparation could defeat pride. The knight in shining armor did not disappear overnight, but from that moment forward he was no longer untouchable, and the peasant was no longer powerless. This is why their story still matters today, because history is not only shaped by kings and generals, it is shaped by ordinary people who refuse to kneel, and that is the true legacy of the peasant armies. If you enjoyed this journey through one of the most shocking chapters in military history, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next epic story. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think about these battles, and tell me where you're watching from in the world. This has been the Saga of Battles, and I'll see you in the next one.